Stephen. The year was 2014. The Angular team decided the time had come to deprecate AngularJS. What was the biggest thing keeping them up at night?
Probably a lot, because deprecating AngularJS was a kind of a shock to a lot of the community. They even went up on stage at a conference called NG Europe with Tombstone saying, all of the technology you know and love is dead. And the biggest problem they had is that the new version wasn't ready yet. And so they had a vision, they had a plan, but there was a moment in time where they kind of just left everyone stranded.
Welcome to the Commit Files from Hero Devs. I'm Wendy Hurst. Today's episode features a guest who's been at the epicenter of one of the most controversial framework migrations in open source history. That might not be true, but it's more dramatic if I say it that way. Moving 2 million engineers from AngularJS to Angular.
AngularJS at Google really started as a pet project of Mishka Hevery, the creator, where he said, hey, I think that the web can be a better place for developers.
Stephen is an expert, almost 25 years in software development, former Angular core team member, developer advocate, wearables fan, framework survivor.
And so he started building this thing, he built a prototype, and he shared it with the world because he really believed in the power of open source.
This is his story.
AngularJS at Google started as a pet project of Mishka Hevery, the creator, where he said, hey, I think that the web can be a better place for developers. And so he started building this thing, he built a prototype, and he shared it with the world because he really believed in the power of open source. It was a little bit of a double-edged sword because other people had that same problem. And he had caught on this spirit of the moment that was just perfect, where he was solving a problem that almost every web developer had of how do we build applications in a simpler way and not have to rewrite the wiring and the piping between state and view and model yourself over and over and over again. And so AngularJS really grew organically over time, just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And what ended up happening was you ended up seeing AngularJS being used at huge enterprises, huge companies, small teams, startups. Everyone was using AngularJS to solve all these problems. And they ended up getting punched in the face a little bit by the framework, because one of the things AngularJS was really good at doing was change detection, where when anything in your page would change, it would go ahead and recalculate everything else in the page. But there was this thing called the digest loop that would take care of this, where if anything changed in your page, it would recalculate everything else, which also might trigger a change. And so if that happened, it would trigger another digest loop. And then this could trigger another digest loop and another digest loop. And so you ended up possibly doing hundreds of these loops, or possibly even infinite loops was a common problem that developers saw, where you built a really non-performant application. You built an application that didn't scale, was tough to debug, all these sorts of things, because you had all of the different parts of your application interacting with each other. And this was something that, as kind of an organically grown framework, was very hard to predict, and it wasn't really architected to prevent that. This ended up becoming the biggest challenge for the Angular team at the time, because AngularJS just didn't have that property of like being architected in a way that would help prevent developers from shooting themselves in the foot, right? Because at some level it's the framework's fault, but also at some level it's the developer's fault. And so, but as a good framework, as a good platform, you need to be worried about the way that your developers are holding you. And fundamentally, they realize that the web is changing, right? We've got new technologies, we've got JavaScript modules, we've got TypeScript. And so they decided, hey, in order to stay relevant and to build a better platform or a better framework for developers, they needed to move things forward. They decided to break compatibility with the way that things had been done before, with this digest loop, with $watch and $apply and all these sorts of things, and move the entire framework forward an entire generation using the modern web. So at the time we had things like JavaScript modules coming along that were very, very new. And also new languages, right? Like I think between the creation of AngularJS and the creation of Angular, there was things like CoffeeScript, and they even saw the future in the writing on the wall, where the Angular team tried to build their own language for writing web applications. It was called @script at the time. And it was very forward-looking. It brought a very Google scale of quality in terms of adding typings. But because it was not a standard, because it was not a universal platform that was being used by everybody, AtScript was a hard sell for a lot of developers. I remember myself sitting at a conference. Even before I joined Google, I was a big user of AngularJS and an expert in it. And I was talking to the team, and I'm like, "What's going on with this AtScript thing? Do I need to really go learn that?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's the direction we're headed." Fortunately for them, they ended up building a partnership with Microsoft, where instead of trying to make AtScript a new thing and find the universe of like building their own language as this tiny little team at Google, they were actually able to lean into some of the work that the TypeScript team was doing at Microsoft, where TypeScript is this evolution of JavaScript that it just adds types, and it has a TypeScript compiler, and it's over time become kind of this industry-proven best practice for building anything with the web or anything with JavaScript. But at the time, no one was using TypeScript. If you look at the TypeScript adoption chart, it starts very, very low, and then you see a giant bump when Angular decided to adopt it for their new version. And so there was a lot of skepticism. I know I was skeptical even after they replaced AtScript with TypeScript, and saying like, I have to learn a new language? Like, this doesn't feel like the web I know. But what you have to realize is that the Angular team was really trying to build the platform and the framework for the future. They were saying, okay, we have seen now hundreds of thousands, we've seen millions of applications be built by developers, getting tons and tons of those at Google, where like literally at Google, if you're relying on some framework that's built internally, you just message the owner and you say, hey, what's going on with this? A lot of Google teams end up having to support not just the framework, but like actually interact directly with developers. And because they had this open source spirit, they were doing that at scale with like teams all over the world. And so they saw where it didn't work, and they wanted to make things a lot better. I don't know if folks are aware of Dart. So there was this question of like, hey, should Dart be the language of the future? And so there were lots of kind of interesting conversations there. And in particular with the world and the universe of developers that were building on AngularJS, there was this big question of like, hey, we're asking you to try something new. We're asking you to try something hard. How is that going to work, right? Because a lot of frameworks, a lot of platforms choose to incrementally migrate. So like, hey, let's add one new feature every 6 months, every year. But instead, they decided to do a big bang. They just rewrote the entire thing from scratch, trying to embody the ideals of AngularJS, but then also adopt to the modern platform approach that they ended up doing. And so all of those things, I think, were very tough decisions, tough conversations, because whenever you have a big bang rewrite versus a incremental migration, those are going to have different impacts on the community, right? If you had an incremental migration, it's very easy for developers to say, yeah, like, okay, I'll just update to the latest version, and then tweak things a little bit so that my app keeps working. But when you have a big bang migration, that ends up becoming a completely different conversation. There were a lot of tools at the time that they tried building, like ng update, that would allow you to mix and match old versions of the applications with new versions of the application, but they were never perfect, right? They were always kind of a little bit kludgy, I think, from the perspective of the developer, where I now am like bootstrapping one application inside of another application, and there's an interoperability layer. It was never a clean path, but one of the things that it ended up doing was that it ended up teaching the rest of the ecosystem to become better developers. And then they, I think at the end of the day, ended up thanking the Angular team for that, right? Like a lot of people didn't like TypeScript at first, were forced to adopt it because of Angular, and then ended up reflecting on that time and saying, wow, I've become a better developer because of this, right? Like I was writing bad code with bugs that I didn't even know about, and now I know about it. And I'm going to take TypeScript with me everywhere I go. So a lot of those decisions, I think, were very tough in the moment, but ended up reflecting really, really well on the team and on the ecosystem. Back in 2015, 2014, I was a Angular expert as part of the Google Developer Experts program. So that meant I was out there speaking at conferences, training developers, mentoring, creating code samples, videos, content, etc., on how to build with AngularJS. And I got a call from Google, ended up joining the team about 6 months before the release of Angular. At that point, it wasn't even called Angular, it was called Angular 2. One of the things that I came in was trying to like, how do we explain this to the world? Because one of the weird things about it was that there was Angular 2 version 2.1 of this core, and then there was 2.2 of the CLI, or we didn't even have a CLI at that point, actually. Like, you had all of these different versions where it was like Angular 2 version 3. And that was really, really confusing for people. So I was one of the ones that was actually ended up proposing, let's just drop the 2, right? They've been talking about Angular 2 coming for 2 years at that point. And it's like, this isn't going to work in a future compatible world where we're following Semver. And so I said, let's just call it Angular. And so we actually had this big campaign called It's Just Angular. And like I was there through kind of this whole RC process where I remember the original document being written where they needed to add modules to Angular, which this was not a thing that was enforced at the code level in the original version of AngularJS. But in Angular, they wanted to create modules to prevent module kidnapping, or component kidnapping, as the design doc said at the time. Which is funny now looking back on 10 years of experience. They've actually gone all the way full circle and gotten rid of modules. And so it's funny that like we had an emergency meeting in one of the last RCs of the Angular 2.0 release where it's like, hey, we need these features. And like just scrambling to like re-architect what does the best practice application look like? How should developers hold this new tool that hopefully makes them much, much more effective? There's a very Google thing that ends up happening where there's actually memes about this across Google where you deprecate the old thing, but the new thing's not ready yet. And you kind of leave developers stranded. And so that was exactly what happened to the AngularJS to Angular transition, where in 2014 they had said all these things are going away, everything you know is dead, but the new thing wasn't ready and it wouldn't be ready for 2 years because building real software takes time and it's difficult. We often think that we can rebuild software faster than we think we can. I fundamentally believe that in a way, all software is emergent. Right? No individual engineer can hold an entire large application in their head, or even a framework or a platform for that matter. And so if software is emergent, you can't kind of necessarily know everything at the front. You have to build a little bit of it, see how it works, see how developers use it. And so maybe they didn't know they were 2 years away from it, but that was the end of truth that ended up happening, where they deprecated the old thing and it was 2 years before the new thing was ready. And I actually think that if you look back now today, this is one of the biggest reasons that React was so successful, because React came in as a modern library, this kind of modern framework, in a time where you couldn't choose AngularJS because it was deprecated, and you couldn't choose Angular because it didn't exist yet and it wasn't stabilized. And so kind of 2014 to 2016 was a very interesting time. But I remember that the team was working so hard, like nights, weekends, frequent design meetings, and the experience just kept getting better and better and better, such that when I think it was September 14th of 2016, we had a big party. We had donuts with like little Angular logos printed on them, and we launched Angular 2.0 to the world. And it was a really, really exciting moment, because for the first time, it was now a rational choice again to choose one of these tech stacks, right? Like we now had a stable version that developers could come in and adopt and make their applications better and start getting into this kind of new modern paradigm. Obviously, at that point, the day we released, the new version was ready, but everyone else was still left on the old version at that point, except for early adopters, a lot of enthusiasts, like this expert community that you end up seeing out there. AngularJS was deprecated or announced to be no longer the future in 2014. I think it was at NG Europe. They put tombstones up on a big slide, and it was a very scary time for developers when you're being told that everything you know and love is going away. And then in 2016, September 2016, they finally launched Angular, what we called then 2.0, and we announced that there was going to be a 6-month major release cycle. So we would go from a major of Angular to the next major of Angular every 6 months. So we went from version 2 directly to version 4. That's a story for another time, maybe, if we want to come back to that. Then from 4 to 5, 6, 7, 8, and now they're about to release, at the time of filming, version 20. So they've been very, very consistent in following this. But AngularJS still existed, and so AngularJS material still existed, and the team was still working on patches for that old version, but it was kind of as little work as possible was what they wanted to spend on AngularJS, because maintaining 2 frameworks is obviously much, much harder than maintaining just one framework. And so the vision there was always to minimize the amount of work that was actually spent on it, just fix, I don't know, critical CVEs, new browser bugs, because the browsers were evolving at the time. JavaScript was progressing in a lot of new ways. And so it was a very tough balance of like, how much resources do you spend on the old thing to keep it going, and to how much do you spend to invest to help developers with bridges from AngularJS to Angular, and how much do you just make the new thing as good as possible, as easy as possible. I remember the pandemic coming and deciding to push that, because it's, from my lens, it was all about minimizing developer pain. And to a certain extent, we could have continued to support AngularJS forever. But at the same time, those investments would almost be wasted, because you're working on a software that has a diminishing number of developers, a user count that was still huge, right? Like, we were talking millions of developers, but it was shrinking over time because we built something that we thought was new and better. And so it was always a question of like, when is the right time to do this? If we do it sooner, we'll drive more adoption of the new thing and we'll help people, but we'll also leave people behind. And that was a very tough decision that we wrestled with for weeks. I remember like hours in conference rooms talking about this, reviewing drafts of the announcement. What parts are we saying are deprecated? What parts are we saying are supported? How good is our transition plan? How much more should we invest in the transition plan? All of those things were really, really tough, because the team cared so much about the developer experience and about kind of moving the ecosystem forward. So much so that if you look at kind of everything they did since 2.0.0, they made a very strong commitment to not leave developers behind. So much so that one of the tools they ended up building, called ng update, really embodied this as more than any other JavaScript framework I've ever seen, or a JavaScript tool, where the team itself was building tooling that would keep your application up to date, so that you barely had to do anything at all in order to stay together as an ecosystem. And so this was the way that the team thought about it. It's like, hey, we never want to leave people behind. So even though we're shipping new majors every 6 months, we're going to be giving people the tools that keeps their application up to date. And we're going to be thinking about this kind of breaking budget, is what I called it, where in any time frame, developers can only handle so much change. And so we were careful to save that budget as much as possible, so that when we need to spend it, we could spend it strategically. And developers say, okay, well, my last 6 updates were really easy, so maybe this one's a little bit harder and it's worth it because I'm going to get these benefits. The team didn't want to leave people behind in the same way they did with the AngularJS to Angular transition. I think the community response was generally positive. It meant that Angular was fully productionized. I mean, this was, we were many majors into Angular at this point. And so I think everyone kind of felt that the new version was ready. It felt good overall as an ecosystem. Hey, it's healthy, we're making good decisions. But I know that behind closed doors, there were, again, millions of developers that were kind of stranded. They're like, okay, I can try and migrate. I can hire a consultancy to migrate. Let me find the budget to put that in my 5-year plan to get off this old technology. And so like we knew that some people had been left behind in that transition. One of the things is a lot of teams started trying to migrate off of AngularJS in like 2014, 2015, 2016, before the new technology was really ready. And so that they ended up choosing a different framework. And to me, this is one of the biggest reasons that I ascribe to React's success in popularity, is because it solved problems using the modern tech stack in a way that AngularJS couldn't. I think we'd done such a good job for the preceding 5 years-ish telegraphing that this was coming, that no one was really surprised. Maybe the one place that was not expectation-based was like compliance-based. When you are a company that is required to use supported software, you might know the end is coming, and maybe there's nothing you can do about it from a budget standpoint, from a resource allocation standpoint. And so the moment that software goes from formally supported, even though there's basically no work going into it, to formally unsupported, that's an unfortunate transition that changes things for you, and it changes the calculus for you. Hindsight is always 20/20. I was not in charge of the Angular project, but if I was in charge of the Angular project, I would have found an incremental path. And I know that sounds way easier to say than it is, right? Like that is months, years of technical work. But I find that if the team hadn't done the very traditional Google thing of deprecating the old thing and then having a big bang rewrite to a new thing, that it would have kept the ecosystem more whole and less fractured, because effectively we had to like re-win market share from ourselves, which was a little bit challenging. Whereas if you go with a more gradual migration, that would have been good. The other one would have been, just don't deprecate it, right? Keep the old version. Like, even if your investment doesn't change a single bit, they were still supporting AngularJS, right? Like, the team was still committing patches, they were still responding to bug reports, all those sorts of things. They could have just not put up the tombstones and called it deprecated, because in effect it was still supported, and it would have been less scary to people to not hear that everything they know and love is going away, and tell the new story of like, what does the new thing look like lands. And a lot of this is very hard to say, because like I wasn't on the team in 2014, and hindsight's always 2020, right? Like, when you look back at these big technology shifts, it's easier in hindsight to predict what would have happened and predict how things would go and how people would respond, because of the benefit of knowledge.
What is the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word migration?
Update. Update was the tool that the Angular team developed after the big AngularJS to Angular transition, where they wanted to keep the ecosystem whole. And so they built this JavaScript tool that would effectively do code-aware transforms of your code based on the changes to the platform and to the framework, where what ends up happening, like the traditional JavaScript way of transitioning and migrating from one version to the next, is you break it, like, or me as a developer, I will update from version 3 to version 4, or from version 9 to 10 or whatever. And I will hope my application keeps working, and if it doesn't, then I'll go debug it a little bit, and then if I can't debug it, then I'll go find a migration guide, and I'll follow the migration guide and all the steps, and hope that my code works, and then test it and try and fix it, and fix it and fix it and fix it until it works. But what is kind of funny about this is, you as the developer are not the most knowledgeable person about what changed between version X and Y. The team that built it is. And so the Angular team's ability to shift that responsibility from the developer to the platform author, the kind of engineers working on the framework, makes so much sense, because the people building the framework understand the change. Like, oh, was it just a rename? Did we remove a parameter? What's the best practice that you have in moving from version X to Y? And so if they can codify that in actual transforms, that solves a huge, huge problem. And the way that they did that was not only building it into this thing called schematics that is built into the Angular CLI, they also designed it in a way that any dependency of your application could do that as well. So if you had an Angular application and you pulled in, I don't know, Firebase, and Firebase needed to move from version 5 to 6, Firebase could supply these, what they were called schematics, so that when you update your Angular version, it automatically updates your Firebase code based on the Firebase's team's knowledge of the changes to the SDK. This ability to automate those migrations was magical. It just took a bunch of work from engineering to codify their understanding of the transition into these code mods that existed in the application. And so when I think about migrations, I still wish that this was a tool that every project out there used, because whenever engineers take responsibility for their migrations, rather than entirely relying on developers to try it, see it, and like figure it out when it breaks, I think that the entire ecosystem, all of software engineering, would be a healthier, happier place.
AngularJS or Angular, which one would survive longer in the wild?
Angular. I used to call it the modern web developers platform, because it's a living thing that is designed to keep up with changes in best practices. One of the things that we see right now is server-side rendering is almost a requirement for high-performant consumer-facing applications. With AngularJS, like, someone may have come along and built like a plugin that does it, whereas the Angular team with Angular is just taking and owning that and saying, hey, now server-side rendering is a core part of our platform. We've thought through it. We've included the community. We've tried it, and now we support it.
What is a buzzword you can't live without?
Word I can't live without. Ecosystem. I don't think anyone can accomplish everything on their own, and I think whenever we rely on each other, we do better. I think AI currently is something that I love, but it's used to describe everything. Where, for example, we used to have artificial intelligence, and we used to have like machine learning as systems that you could build. Like, I remember Google, they had like autocomplete, right? Very intelligent autocomplete. They had assistants that could recognize your voice. These were not powered by the same large language models that we have today. For example, I built a whole bunch of apps that would like automatically, like you would favorite, I don't know, music videos, and it would recommend new music videos to you. And I just used like Bayesian algorithms to look for probabilistic and statistical connections between users, and then use that to drive a recommendation engine. All of that is intelligence coming from a machine, but it's not a large language model. And so you still have a lot of these very structured, rigorous ways of using machine intelligence that all just get bundled into this magical category of AI now. And so I think if we could be a little bit more specific when we talk about AI, what we mean, and like where it's large language models, where it's generative AI, where it's like statistical analysis, whether it's big data, like I think bringing back some of those older terms would be really, really helpful.
You kind of gave a few of the pieces of the answer to my question already, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. What does supporting the developers you leave behind look like in practice?
It's interesting because there's a bunch of things that come even before that question, which is like, how do you not leave them behind, right? How do you give people a migration path? But if you have left them behind, I think it's important that you don't leave them high and dry. And what I mean by that is like, how can you organize the ecosystem? How can you organize the community such that there is an answer for every question? So one of the things that we saw when I was at Google was, if we're leaving all these teams behind with AngularJS, what happens if a CVE comes along? What happens if a security bug comes in, or a browser bug? Having an option, even if that doesn't come from Google, solves a problem for everybody, because then we don't have to go worry about that and be like, oh, we abandoned them, and we've not just abandoned them, we've shunned them when they're in their moment of pain. And so ideally, you don't leave them behind at all. You keep them with you through minimizing the breaking. You manage the breaking budget, all those sorts of things. But if you do leave them behind, find ways to help organize and drive, whether it's community, whether it's ecosystem, solutions to whatever problems they have.
What does success look like when you're about to create pain for millions of developers?
When I think about creating success for developers at the same time as you're about to create pain, number one that comes to mind is justifying that pain. If you are going to create pain for developers, what is the value proposition of what are they going to get out of that? And I think trying to couple the pain and the benefit as closely as possible is going to kind of justify the pain and hopefully make it worth it, so that they at the end end up better than if they hadn't. If you can't justify it, and like the pain, instead of coming from that place of creating more value, maybe it comes from reducing cost and focusing on the right things or something like that, then to me, success is hopefully just organizing and directing folks to help them find an answer. Because if you're stuck and you've tried every tutorial, you've tried every automatic technique, you've tried everything, like there still has to be another option, right? Like there has to be someone I can go to, someone I can pay to get help.
Stephen, you were part of the team when Google partnered with XLTS, which is now Hero Devs, to provide extended lifetime support, or what we call never-ending support, for AngularJS past its end of life. Why would an open source project want to partner with a company like Hero Devs for that?
Yeah, it's been really interesting being on kind of both sides of that conversation, because when I was on the Angular team at Google, we struggled with how do we support AngularJS developers, right? Like we knew we were abandoning them. We knew there were lots of projects around. And we did what we could, but there was only so much we could do. And so the idea that a company could come in and step in and provide the security guarantees if a CVE ever did come up that it would affect AngularJS, that in many ways it was a win-win-win, right? Because the users of it had somewhere they could go if they needed to stay compliant. They had government regulatory needs of any form. The Angular team didn't have to spend any time thinking about it. And a company could create that value and hopefully make money and be self-sustaining based on that.
What advice would you give a team who is sunsetting a widely used open source tool today?
Why are you sunsetting? Why do you have to do that? Maybe there's a migration path. So I think sunsetting is always hard, right? Like one of the phrases that I talk about or have conversed a lot about people with is, what % of code is alive today? Which is a really interesting question, because most software, I would argue, in the world is actually unmaintained, right? It was written some period in the past. If a lot of teams only have manual testing, and so that code may not have even been tested in years, where like most of the code in the world is dead. And so how can we keep as much of that code alive and as functional as possible? And so when you're sunsetting this, is how do we think about how do we keep this going? I almost relate it back to video games, which is like, it was really easy to preserve video games from the 80s and 90s because they were these kind of self-contained entities. But as you go forward to the 2000s, you look at World of Warcraft. There's no way to archive World of Warcraft because it's this online kind of human experience. And I think there's a lot of connections between that and software, where building software is this kind of human, engaged, connected experience where when you deprecate something, when you leave it behind, you're giving up on the chat rooms where people can answer it, and conferences and things like that. And so whenever possible, having this as smooth as possible migration path where it's incremental rather than kind of big bang, it's going to be much more successful. But if you are forced to sunset something, leave them behind, I think leaving as many trails and capabilities for self-service as possible, so that if they for some reason can't migrate, they're as empowered as possible to do it themselves. I think that's the win.
Do you think we'll ever see a framework dominate like AngularJS once did?
I don't think we're going to see a framework dominate like AngularJS did. I think there are always trade-offs in every technology stack, in every technology choice that you had. I was in a call today where we were discussing, well, if we use approach A, then developers can't do this. If we do approach B, developers can't do that. And so I think there's always trade-offs. And so there's room in a healthy ecosystem for those different trade-offs because they're going to benefit others. I do think that there's value to having maybe a handful of dominant players, like the Next.js Reacts of the world, the Angulars of the world, where you have that sufficient ecosystem, you have that the trainers, the tutorials, the courses, the conferences, the community, all these sorts of things to give you a higher level experience. And so I don't think there's ever going to be one framework to rule them all, because like these are valid technical and business trade-offs between all these different things. But at the same time, having a handful of dominant ones that are big enough to support that ecosystem is self-propelling and self-perpetuating and valuable to everybody. I think there's a lot of fear right now around what's the role of AI going to play, and like what are junior developers going to do in a world where senior developers can just direct AI to do things based on their theory knowledge. But I do think the most exciting thing is that we can really focus on innovation and advancing the state of the art in a way that maybe we couldn't before, where I can leave some of the low-level coding of for loops or component scaffolding to the CLIs and the tools and the AIs that exist out there, and really focus on what is my business doing and why do I want my business to work this way, and how do I want to architect my application for scale and for finding product market fit. And so I think at the end of the day, we write software to serve users. And the more you can focus on your users rather than random little bugs, scaffolding, getting started, piping and wiring under the hood, the more value I can create for the world. So I think finding that right balance of how much a software engineer should be building, how much a software engineer should be tooling, and how much a software engineer should be relying on automated systems for, I think that is a really exciting place where if you strike the balance wrong, you go too AI too early, you're going to build something that's not maintainable, it's not scalable, and your product's going to fall apart. But if you can combine this understanding of kind of what you're building and why you're building it, and use that to progress the system and evolve a system in a high quality way that serves the needs of users, like that's going to be a win, and that's going to progress society.
Big thanks to Stephen for opening up on the commit files with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more entertaining tech content from Hero Devs on LinkedIn, x.com, YouTube, and our website at herodevs.com. We'll see you next time.